Open up your Bibles to that text of Luke 6 and let us address the question that Jesus asked on this occasion. If I had gotten up here before 6, I was going to try to get everybody to move right down here, and I'll stand right there and we'll talk. But we didn't get that done. So if we have another night like this, we're going to get comfortable together, crowd right in here, be close together and have a talk. So right now, let's act like we're together and let's have a talk. Let's understand this text, Luke chapter 6. Questions that Jesus asked, questions from the man who had all the answers. It's an interesting question to me, and maybe it will be to you. See what you think about it. First of all, let's do a little background work. If you go back in Luke chapter 6 to verse 17, notice what it says. I'm watching to see if you're looking at text. I'm watching. See, fewer people I can catch every one of you even better. So be looking at text. Better find you a Bible. There's some under the pew, by the way, if you need one. And because I don't mind. Oh, yeah, that's right. It's on your own. Yes, I know that, Jackie. You can use your electronic version. Perfectly fine. I understand that. But, I don't mind walking up to you and handing you a Bible when we're finished if we need to. So just grab you one and let's look at it. Verse 17. He came down with them and stood on a level place with a crowd of his disciples. And here's the question. The parallel passage to this, at least in wording and in terminology, hold your finger there, like I'm doing. Go to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 48, or really the whole text of 38 to 48, is an accounting of the same basic idea. The question, as it is asked in Luke, is, the first one, if you greet those who love you, what credit is that to you? The question in Matthew 5, verse 47, if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Well, now, back up in Matthew 5 to verse 1. And seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. Here's the question. Are these parallel passages? Well, someone might say, can't be parallel passages because they don't say the same thing. Well, you don't have to say the exact same thing to be a parallel passage. For instance, even today, if you take two news reporters and you put them in a room and there was a man giving a speech and they're going to report on the speech, each of them will give his account of what he heard. And it won't be exactly the same. Some will say this, one will highlight these words, the other will highlight these words. So it's possible that these are parallel passages. Then someone says, well, now wait a minute. In Luke, he came down and stood on a level place, and in Matthew, he went up on a mountain. Well, some have said that these could still be parallel because you see, Matthew was down here, and he looked up and he saw him go up on a mountain. And Luke was up here and saw him come down to a level place on the side of the mountain where Luke was. Well, that still could be true. Now, whether this is an exact parallel passage or not, when you look at the rest of Matthew 5, 6, and 7, many of the same themes are found in Luke 6. So it almost appears to me that Luke 6 summarizes what Matthew 5, 6, and 7 said. It is highly possible to me that Luke is giving his account in a condensed form of the same sermon that Matthew records in chapters 5, 6, and 7. I give you that as extra. You don't have to pay for that part. Steve Smith is the only one who bought a ticket for listening to me preach this morning based on what I mentioned. I'm not going to say what else I said, Steve. Don't worry about it. Okay, now we go to Luke 6. Okay, let's get into this question. As oftentimes happens when you look at a text, you're trying to figure out what it says, whether it's a question or it's just a statement. One of the first things you might do is you say, what is not going on? Okay? The text says that we're talking about, particularly, it says, if you love, verse 32, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? We could also use the question in 33. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? We could also use the question in verse 34. If you lend to those from whom you would hope to receive back, what credit is that to you? It's three questions stating the same concept, talking about three different ideas. We could use any one of those three to say, what is Jesus saying? Well, first of all, what is he not saying? He is not saying, stop doing this. In other words, he is not saying, quit loving those who love you. Right? He's not saying, stop loving people who love you. He's not saying, don't do good to people who do good to you. Stop it. Well, that can't be what he's saying. He can't be saying, quit lending to people who will give the money back to you. He's not saying he's not saying stop. Number two, he's not saying there is no value in it. No value at all. When you do good to those when you love those that love you, no value there. Well, I think there is some value there. And if you do good to those who do good to you, there's still some value there, right? And if you're lending money, even though they're going to give it back, isn't there some value there? Well, sure. So he's not saying there is no value. I'll tell you what else he's not saying. He's not saying by asking the question, you don't have to do this. Where did you get the idea that you have to be good or love people that love you? You don't have to. You don't have to be good to people that are good to you. You don't have to lend to people. You just don't. He's not saying that. So whatever these questions are about, those three things, I am sure he is not saying. So now we need to figure out what is he saying. Well, to do that, I want us to examine three key things, I think, that happen in this Luke 6 passage. All right, let's notice them together. Look at verse 32, 33, 34. We have a common phrase, don't we? The New King James says, what credit is that to you? Now, I don't know what your translations say, but I suspect that you have translations that word it somewhat differently. Now, you take whatever your translation has and listen to how it seems to be. If this translation is right, then I don't think this translation is saying exactly what needs to be said. And I'm not sure that I've read one that does. So I'm going to tell you what I think it needs to say, and then you tell me if you have a translation that says that. Just let me know, and I'd be glad to know it. Here's what I think is going on. If this passage says, what credit is that to you? It says it 3 times. That sounds like it's saying to me, what benefit is that to you? Storing up credit for the future, like checking it off, putting it in your pocket, holding on to it, putting it in the bank so you can call it out later. Like you're going, I'm going to do this and I'm going to get some credit, right? It's like doing something nice for your wife. For the next time you're in the doghouse, you can throw it out and say, see, you got to let me out quicker because I did something nice. All right, we understand that concept. All right, if that's what he's saying, then to me this text doesn't make any sense. So to help us understand what he's saying, let's understand what it's saying. The word here is not what credit is that to you. The actual word is, what grace is that to you? That's what the Greek says, charis, grace. You know this word, charis. There are a few Greek words you might recognize when they are said, and this one is charis. You know it as grace. You understand what grace is. The grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men, and we could talk about all kinds of things. You talk about grace. So now let's read it again. If you love those who love you, what grace is that to you? Here's what I think he's saying. If you love those who love you, How much grace does that put into your account? Or better yet, how does that make you a gracious person? If you merely love those who love you, how does that make you a person of grace? 33, if you do good, I think that the intent is merely, if you merely do good to those who do good to you, how does that make you a person of grace? Verse 34, if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive back, how does that make you a person of grace? When you think of somebody and you say, that person is so gracious, what do you mean? Don't you mean that they go beyond the call of duty? Don't you mean that it has something about their temperament? They're so sweet and nice, and they just work in your behalf and in your benefit, and it has to do with people who go beyond loving those who love them, beyond doing good to those who do good to them, beyond borrow or lending only to those who are going to give it back. Read this verse with the concept. How is that grace to you? Let's look at the second way to understand this. Look at verse 34 or verse 35. Notice what he says. But love your enemies, do good, and lend. Those are the three questions. Those are the three questions. Love your enemies, that's verse 32. If you love those who love you, obviously he's saying, love your enemies. See? The second, love your enemies, do good. That's the second question, verse 33. And lend, hoping for nothing in return. That's the third question from verse 34. But notice what he says. And your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. Now let's examine that. To understand this text, these questions, he says, whatever the answer is, you will be sons of the Most High. So he's talking about God the Father and what He is, and then through these questions, what you do to be a son or a daughter of the Most High. And the key is the last phrase of verse 35. He is kind to the unthankful and the evil. Once again, we understand that. I get it. God is kind to those who are not thankful. God is kind to those who are outright evil. He is. Back in the text of Matthew 5, it says He causes the rain to come on the just and the unjust. He sends His Son on the good and on the evil. He is. That's right. But notice what the text actually says. Look at the end of verse 35. It actually says, He is kind to the ungracious. Here's what I mean. That word credit, or that phrase that occurs 3 times that we looked at, what credit is that to you? Whatever your version says. That word credit and this word unthankful, same word, except the un part. See, in Greek, you have a word, it's charis. That means grace. Now, if you want to say the opposite of grace, meaning not grace or ungrace, in Greek, you put an A at the beginning of the word. So in 32, 33, 34, it says charis, grace. In 35, it says charis, and in another form, charis menos. Not grace. What's he saying? God is kind to those who are not gracious. That's what he's saying. Therefore, to understand the question, here's what he's asking. Here's how we have to understand it. Am I kind in humankind? By human definition of kind. That is, I just mete out to others what they mete out to me. That's mankind. Or am I God kind? I mete out beyond what somebody metes out to me. When it says He is kind, He's asking me to ask myself, how am I kind? Am I kind like everybody else in the world who just does as has been done to them? That's kind. I mean, if somebody walks up to you and says, you are a really nice person, and you go, you are too, isn't that kind? Sure it is. But God is kind this way. Someone walks up to you and says, I don't like you. And you go, I'm sorry, but I like you. That's God kind. He's asking us to say to yourself, what kind of kind are you? Mankind or God kind? Third way that we need to see to answer this question is verse 36. Therefore, be merciful, just as your Father also is merciful. I didn't know this until this study. Here we go. The common word for mercy is a word, elios, and it means mercy. That is, doing something to take away what somebody deserves or prevent happening what somebody deserves to happen. The story of the prodigal son, Luke chapter 10, not the prodigal son, the Good Samaritan, Luke chapter 10. You remember the story. Without going into it fully, the Good Samaritan is the one who helped the guy, right? Jesus asked a question after telling the story. He said, you know the story, you know the question, who was the neighbor? And they said, the one who showed mercy. The Good Samaritan did something. What did he do? He fixed a situation. He helped a person who could not help himself and who did not deserve being helped necessarily by this individual. He extended mercy. It's a word of action. This word mercy is not a word of action. It precedes the action. This word, ortiminos, is a word that means compassion. Compassion. You see, the ancient people thought that mercy, real kindness and real compassion comes from the gut. That's what this word is. That's why in the old King James you hear the term bowels of compassion. It's way down deep inside of you. So here's the question. To understand these questions, I have to understand this. I have to be compassionate, way down deep like God is. God is viscerally compassionate to people without respect for what they have or have not done. So he's asking me this question. In these three things, these three wordings of the same idea, here's what God is saying. He's wanting me to ask myself this. Do I have a visceral, way down deep compassion for people regardless of how they have or have not treated me? Now, to close out the study, back up to Matthew 5 and verse 48. Assuming that this is a parallel passage, and even if it's not, it's a parallel meaning. Go back to Matthew 5. We'll close with verse 48. Therefore, you shall be perfect, just as your Father who is in heaven is perfect. We studied this word in our Greek class recently on a Wednesday night, and this word is teleos. And it doesn't mean moral perfection, morally doing everything right. It means to be complete. To be complete. He says, you need to have in you the completeness of God. Now, let's put that together. Go back to Luke 6. Let's go back and answer the question. Here's what's going on. Why is Jesus asking these questions? Here's what I think is going on. If you want to be a son or a daughter of God, the Most High, we have to have the completeness of Him in ourselves in this way. I am going to love those who in fact don't love me. And I am going to do good to people who don't do good to me. And I am going to lend to those who are in need, knowing that I might not ever and probably won't get it back. Because that is the completeness of the character of the Most High. Then I'm complete. So to these disciples, He wanted them to get past equal action toward people and think about unequal action above and beyond the call of duty, going farther than they go. And in the other sermon in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, He develops it that way. Go the second mile. Give your cloak and your coat. That, I think, is what Jesus is saying in these questions. And I would be interested in knowing tonight from any of your versions this phrase, what credit is that to you? How others have translated it, and does it fit more like it seems to me that it should? Okay. Hope that stirs some thought for you. Hope that gives you good Bible study time. And before we leave, let us be aware that someone might need us to pray for them and help them in some way. And as our custom, we sing to give them that encouragement, to let us know about that. So if you need us tonight in any way, will you come as we stand and sing?